You find yourself looking upward, not at the horizon, but at the deep expanse of night. For thousands of years before the modern compass, the stars were more than ornaments scattered across the sky. To the people of Polynesia, they were maps, not metaphorical maps, but real working guides, etched into memory and recited in chants that lasted until dawn. Imagine, for a moment, that you are seated in the hollow of a great double-hulled canoe. The wood beneath you creaks. Salted air clings to your skin, and the sound of the sea pressing against the hull is the only rhythm you cannot escape. There is no parchment in your lap, no compass in your hand. Instead, you have the sky, a sky your grandfather taught you to read, and which his grandfather taught him. Each star named, each rising and setting point etched into stories passed from tongue to tongue. The Polynesian navigators built a world of precision in a time when much of the planet still stumbled in the dark. Their voyages covered distances that astonish even modern sailors. Thousands of miles across the Pacific, from island to island, without metal instruments, without written charts. Yet they arrived. Again and again they arrived. And at the center of this achievement was not simply boldness, but patience. Patience to watch the stars. Each star had a role, a fixed place in the mind's chart. The navigators organized them into star lines or star paths. These were remembered as though they were invisible roads stretched across the sea. The stars rose in the east, traveled their arc, and set in the west. Where they touched the horizon became a compass point. A navigator might recall, follow Aldebaran rising, then steer toward where Altair sinks. These instructions were not written but sung, forming chants that could last the length of a night's voyage. To forget a line was to risk the canoe. To remember was to guarantee landfall. But stars alone were not enough. The sea, too, spoke. Polynesian navigators could read swells in the water, noticing how long waves bent and curved around unseen islands. They felt the tilt of the canoe, the pull of undercurrents, the habits of seabirds at dawn and dusk. Even the clouds played their part. Large, stationary clouds often gathered above islands, betraying land long before it could be seen. This was navigation not by tools, but by the body. The canoe was the instrument, and the navigator its reader. We often imagine such voyages as filled with drama, storms, discovery, and conquest. But in truth, much of the time was filled with silence. Silence and repetition. The crew adjusted sails, bailed water, chewed on dried taro or breadfruit. The navigator sat still, eyes scanning the horizon, repeating star names under his breath, as though reminding himself of an order that could not be disturbed. To travel was not always to conquer, but to endure. Historians often overlook this endurance, focusing instead on the boldness of discovery. Yet the greater story may be the patience required in the middle days of a voyage. Imagine day after day of open sea, no land in sight. The salt stiffens your clothes. The sun cracks your lips. The meals taste the same. Each morning the navigator checks the swell. Each evening he begins again, calling the stars by name, measuring distance not in miles but in remembered chants. The voyage was not heroic in the moment. It was tedious. It was boring. And yet it was essential. The great voyages of the Polynesians stitched together an ocean. From Samoa to Hawaii, from Tahiti to Rapa Nui. They created networks of islands that were not isolated but connected. Each successful landfall meant survival. Each mistake could mean death. And in the quiet of those voyages, humanity proved something extraordinary. That patience, memory, and observation could defeat even the vastest sea. But one question lingers. These star maps were never written, never recorded in ink. They lived in memory, in chants, in the fragile thread of oral tradition. How many were lost before they reached us? How many routes faded when a navigator died, taking with him the secret of the stars? When you consider the immensity of the Pacific Ocean, it is difficult not to wonder how knowledge endured. Unlike empires that inscribed their power in stone or ink, the Polynesian world relied on memory. A single star map could cover thousands of miles of travel, yet it was carried in the mind, never on parchment. That knowledge was fragile, but it was also fiercely protected. The Polynesian navigator, known in some traditions as a wayfinder, was not an ordinary sailor. He was a living archive, To become one was a process that began in childhood, and often it did not begin by choice. A boy might be selected by an elder because of his attentiveness, his patience, or his ability to remember chants without error. Once chosen, he would sit at night beside the old master, repeating the names of stars until his tongue stumbled, repeating again until it did not. This apprenticeship was not a matter of months. It was a matter of decades. The ocean was not generous to the impatient. A navigator might spend years simply learning the rising and setting points of a few stars before he was trusted with longer paths. Knowledge was given slowly, and it was given orally, always in rhythm, always in song. A chant that lasted hours could be carried intact across generations, its musical cadence acting as both memory aid and safeguard against forgetting. The training went beyond the stars. Apprentices learned to read the sea. They placed their hands over the gunnels of the canoe and felt the swells in the dark, memorizing the subtle shift when a current bent against an island. They studied the flight patterns of birds, learning which species flew out at dawn and returned at dusk, signaling the presence of land nearby. They stared at cloud formations, practicing patience as they waited for faint outlines of islands to be revealed in their bases. To be a navigator was to carry in your body the weight of generations of observation. And this knowledge was not shared widely. It was restricted, often to a few men in each community, guarded as if it were sacred. For it was sacred. The survival of the people depended upon it. If the knowledge was spread too thinly, it risked dilution. If it was shared carelessly, the community could lose its greatest asset. Thus, navigators were both revered and isolated. They sat apart in council, honored in rituals, yet always aware that their role demanded restraint, silence, and precision. Over time, lineages of navigators formed. A family might be known for producing skilled wayfinders, passing the knowledge from father to son, uncle to nephew. These lineages acted as living libraries, preserving fragments of maps across generations. The memory of a particular route, say, from Tahiti to the Marquesas, might be held in one family, while another carried the knowledge of the course from Hawaii to Samoa. Together, they formed a network of knowledge, each community guarding its fragment, yet all connected by the sea. The star compass itself was not always taught directly. Instead, apprentices learned by immersion. They sat through endless nights of repetition. They sailed on short voyages first, where the risk was smaller, repeating chants until they could do so without hesitation. Each mistake was corrected gently, for the cost of forgetting in practice was nothing compared to the cost of forgetting at sea. A single misplaced star could mean days of delay, loss of supplies, or worse. One fascinating element of this system was its ability to adapt. Navigators did not treat the sky as fixed in the way modern charts do. They accounted for subtle shifts in the heavens, remembering how certain stars appeared higher or lower depending on latitude. The oral system was flexible, resilient, and capable of adjusting to the realities of long voyages. This adaptability was part of its strength. Written maps might grow outdated, but memory could bend with the sea. Imagine the scene of an apprentice lying awake on the beach beside his master. The stars wheel above them, endless and unmoving, yet full of pattern. The elder points with a weathered hand and says the name of a star. The boy repeats it. He is corrected. He repeats again. The chant begins low and steady, lasting until the stars have completed their arc tomorrow night. The lesson continues. 1,000 nights of repetition, until the names flow without hesitation, until the sky itself feels like a familiar house. The patience required for this is almost unimaginable to modern ears. Today, we expect knowledge to be stored externally, in books, on screens, in charts. But for these apprentices, the mind itself was the vessel. Forgetting was not permitted. The pressure was quiet but immense, like the swell beneath a canoe. Constant, steady, unavoidable. There are, of course, questions we cannot answer. How many chants have been lost to time? How many apprentices failed to remember? Their mistakes buried beneath waves. The Pacific kept no records, only survivors. Those who did remember, those who carried the knowledge, ensured that communities could thrive on distant islands, that voyages could be repeated, that humans could weave a web of life across a seemingly endless sea. But even the most skilled apprentice eventually faced the same test. The first true voyage. The moment when the chants of stars were no longer rehearsals, but lifelines. Imagine standing at the edge of a canoe as the horizon swallows the last outline of land. Behind you, the comfort of the shore fades. Before you, nothing but open water. It is in that moment that memory is tested, that the apprentice becomes navigator, and that the true measure of patience, precision, and endurance is revealed. Yet one cannot help but wonder, when the apprentices first took the helm, when they first trusted the chants of their elders against the silence of the ocean, did they ever feel doubt? Did they ever look up at the stars and question whether memory alone could hold the weight of the sea? At last, the chants become more than memory. They become direction. The canoe, heavy with provisions of dried taro, coconuts, and gourds of water, pushes away from shore. The hulls creak, the lashings hum under strain, and the horizon begins to consume the last visible outline of land. What lies ahead is not visible. It is trusted. For the Polynesian navigator, each voyage was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because it was repeated countless times across centuries. Extraordinary, because each successful crossing represented the survival of knowledge itself. The apprentices had trained for this moment. The stars were in place. The swells whispered their steady rhythm, and the birds followed their ancient habits. Now it was a matter of endurance. Most of a voyage was not discovery, but monotony. The sea is rarely generous with drama. Days passed with sails adjusted, ropes tightened, and water rationed. Salt clung to the skin. Lips cracked under the sun, and meals became predictable, chewed more for sustenance than taste. The navigator remained still, his eyes on the horizon, repeating the chants under his breath. Memory was always in motion, even when the canoe was not. The crew trusted him without question. For on the open sea, doubt could spread like rot. The navigator's authority was not based on force, but on silence. His confidence, his ability to sit unmoving, to speak the names of stars as though they were family, created the only certainty available. Even when no land was in sight, his presence was proof that the voyage was possible. And then, slowly, signs would emerge. A shift in the swell, so subtle that only the navigator could feel it. The sudden appearance of a bird at dawn, flying in a purposeful direction. Clouds that gathered heavy and unchanging, above a distant island too small to yet see. These signs were woven into the chant, remembered as surely as the stars. A navigator would notice. He would adjust the course slightly. He would not say, "Land is near," because certainty was dangerous. But his silence carried weight, and the crew sensed it. Days later, when the outline of land finally emerged on the horizon, it seemed less like discovery and more like confirmation of what had always been known. Landfall was not a triumphant event. It was quiet. Relief, yes, but also work. The canoe approached cautiously, aware of reefs and currents. The crew unloaded supplies, stretched their stiffened limbs, and prepared to begin again. The navigator, having proven memory against sea, stepped on the shore as though nothing remarkable had occurred. But in truth, the voyage was remarkable. Every successful arrival meant that the chants lived on, that the ocean's memory was still intact. Much depended on these arrivals. A mistake in navigation could mean not just delay, but disaster. Supplies were finite. Water could run low. Storms could scatter canoes beyond recovery. Thus, survival strategies were embedded in every voyage. Provisions were measured carefully, with food and water rationed strictly. Fishing lines were cast daily, and the sea often provided, though not always when needed. Canoes were designed for balance and endurance, lashed together with precision, so they could flex without breaking. But survival was not only material. It was mental. The chants, repeated endlessly, gave rhythm to the days, anchoring the crew in memory when the horizon gave no anchor at all. Each man knew his role. Each motion repeated until it became habit. Survival was not about heroism, but about routine. Over centuries, these voyages wove a network across the Pacific. Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti, Rapa Nui. All were connected not by written charts, but by memory carried in the minds of navigators. To the outside world, these islands seemed isolated. To the Polynesians, they were threads in a single web, each reachable, each part of a larger whole. This was not exploration for the sake of glory. It was continuity. Communities grew, traded, married, and shared across thousands of miles. The Pacific, so vast and modernized, was a living highway to those who knew how to read it. And yet it was fragile. When a navigator died without passing on his chance, an entire route could vanish. Oral knowledge was strong, but it depended on continuity. Disruption, through war, famine, or cultural change, could erase it. Historians today believe that many routes were lost long before European contact, their chance silenced by time. The ocean remembers only what is repeated. Still, fragments survived. In the 20th century, when much of this knowledge had nearly disappeared, a few elders in Micronesia and Polynesia kept the chance alive. Apprentices once again sat at their sides, repeating the star names, relearning how to feel the swells. Voyages were repeated, proving once more that memory could conquer distance. You might be tempted to think of these voyages as primitive, overshadowed by compasses, sextants, and charts. But consider this. Long before much of the world had ventured beyond sight of its own shores, the Polynesians had crossed an ocean wider than all the continents combined, not by tools of iron, but by patience, memory, and the silent guidance of stars. What does it mean, then, that knowledge so fragile could achieve something so vast? Perhaps it tells us that endurance is not always about invention. Sometimes it is about memory. Sometimes the greatest journeys are not written in books, but carried in silence, passed from tongue to tongue, from elder to apprentice, until the stars themselves become familiar paths. And perhaps the question remains unresolved. If so much could be achieved with nothing more than memory and patience, what other knowledge, quiet, forgotten, boring to most eyes, still waits, hidden in the edges of history, capable of changing the way we see the world? The first sound is not the rooster, nor the stirrings of the town, but the bell, a low, heavy tone that rolls across fields still wrapped in mist. You have heard it in the darkness before dawn, its vibration carrying to the stone cloisters, through the cold air of narrow cells, pulling every monk from sleep. Life in a medieval monastery was not measured by sunrises or sunsets, but by the bell. It marked the hours of prayer, of work, of study, and of silence. To live inside these walls was to surrender your time to a rhythm older and stronger than your own desires. The bell was a clock, and its chime was unquestioned. Most monasteries across Europe followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a set of guidelines written in the 6th century. It was not dramatic reading. It prescribed humility, obedience, stability, and balance. It demanded that a monk's day be divided between prayer, manual labor, and study. Its power lay in its detail. When to rise, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. Nothing was left to chance. The rule insisted on moderation. Monks were not to fast excessively, nor to indulge. Meals were simple, meat rarely permitted, wine measured, and portions carefully weighed. Silence was encouraged, but not demanded without end. Even conversation was regulated, directed towards spiritual growth. To an outsider, such a life might appear monotonous. To those inside, monotony was the point. Imagine rising in the dark, the air damp with cold, and moving silently to the chapel. The first prayers of the day, matins and lauds, were said before the sun. Candles flickered against stone walls, voices murmured in chant. And the day began not with action but with submission. Hours later, when the sun had risen, the community gathered again for prime, the first daytime office, reminding themselves that the day itself was not their own but God's. The chanting of psalms filled much of the day. These were not sung for beauty, but for rhythm and memory. Monks cycled through the psalms so that, within a week, all 150 were recited. The words were ancient, repetitive, and steady. Each monk had his place, his role, his line to chant. The sameness was not accidental. It was a path to devotion. But prayer alone did not fill the day. The rule required manual labor. Each monk had duties, often seasonal, always necessary. In the summer months, they might be sent to the fields to tend crops or repair fences. In the winter, they copied manuscripts, mended clothes, or brewed ale. The monastery was a self-sufficient world, and each man's labor ensured its survival. The image of monks as mere scribes is incomplete. They were farmers, brewers, carpenters, and beekeepers. The copying of manuscripts was important, but it was only one task among many. And even this task was slow, repetitive, often tedious. Sitting for hours, bent over parchment, tracing letters by candlelight, was not a romantic pursuit, but a test of endurance. Ink-stained fingers, cramped hands, tired eyes. These were the realities of preservation. Yet through such tedium, knowledge was carried forward. At midday, the bell rang again, summoning the monks to the refectory. Meals were plain: bread, vegetables, beans, sometimes fish. Meat was rare, except for the sick. The food was not meant to delight, but to sustain. Conversation was forbidden. Instead, one monk read aloud from a book, often scripture or commentary, while the others ate in silence. The words of the text became nourishment alongside the bread, filling the room not with chatter, but with steady cadence. Silence extended beyond meals. Many monasteries required the great silence after Compline, the final prayer of the day. From that moment until morning, no unnecessary words were spoken. The world shrank to footsteps, to the rustle of robes, to the sound of wind against stone. To modern ears, such a life might sound oppressive. Yet for those who lived it, the repetition offered stability. The world outside was unpredictable: wars, famines, plagues. Inside the monastery, time was steady, predictable, controlled. Each day was like the last, and that sameness was its comfort. For the monks, holiness was not found in sudden revelations, but in endurance. To rise when the bell rang, to chant when the psalm began, to till the earth when ordered, these small obediences were the substance of devotion. The extraordinary was not required. The ordinary, repeated faithfully, was enough. And yet, even as you picture the rows of chanting monks, the steady toll of bells, the endless cycle of prayer and labor, a question lingers. Did every monk truly find peace in this routine? Or did some lie awake in their narrow cells, wondering if obedience alone could quiet the restless thoughts of the human heart? If the fields and the kitchens fed the body, it was the library that fed the mind. But this was not a library in the modern sense. There were no shelves to wander, no whispers between readers, no soft creak of pages being turned. A medieval monastery's library was often little more than a locked room, its precious manuscripts chained to desks or stored in wooden chests. Access was controlled. Books were few, valuable, and fragile. The true labor was not in reading, but in copying. Scribes sat in silence, bent over slanted desks, quills sharpened and inkpots close at hand. Their task was not invention, but endurance, copying line after line of text without error. Mistakes were costly. Parchment was expensive, ink not easily wasted. Corrections were made carefully, sometimes by scraping away letters with a knife and rewriting over the smooth surface. Imagine the rhythm of such work. Dip the quill, press the nib to parchment. Form each letter deliberately. A page might take hours. A single book, months or years. Candlelight strained the eyes. Winter's cold stiffened the fingers. Summer's heat softened the ink. It was not glamorous, but it was steady. Through this repetition, ancient knowledge survived. Many of the works we now know from antiquity, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, survived only because some nameless monk copied them in a quiet room. Their interest may not have been philosophical curiosity, but simple obedience to the rule, which prescribed reading and study. Yet the effect was the same. Libraries grew, knowledge endured, and fragments of the classical world slipped quietly through the centuries of medieval silence. Even within this silence, the human mind left traces. Margins sometimes carry small notes, complaint about the cold, remarks about the poor quality of parchment, even jokes. One scribe wrote, "I am very tired," in the margin of a psalter. Another added, "The parchment is hairy." These whispers across time remind us that behind the uniform letters was a human hand, weary and restless, struggling against monotony. And yet, such monotony was the point. Copying was not an act of self-expression, but of humility. The scribe's duty was not to create, but to preserve, to submerge himself in the repetition of another's words. In that submission, he believed, lay virtue. To maintain order, monasteries developed catalogs, lists of which books were held, where they were stored, and which monk had borrowed them. These catalogs were often the first step toward organized libraries. They were practical, yes, but they were also expressions of control. Nothing was to be lost, nothing misplaced. Knowledge was treated like food or land, measured, accounted for, safeguarded. Though most manuscripts were religious, psalters, commentaries, homilies, there were also texts on medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and law. Monks needed practical knowledge to sustain their communities, and so they copied works that explained how to grow crops, treat illnesses, or measure time. The preservation of the secular was often incidental, but it was real. Without it, Europe might have lost far more of its intellectual inheritance. It is easy to imagine the monks as uninterested in worldly learning. Yet the truth is more complex. For them, all knowledge was part of God's creation. To study the stars was to understand his order. To read Aristotle was not rebellion, but exploration of how reason could complement faith. The boundaries between sacred and secular were porous, and the library reflected that. Picture the scriptorium, the writing room, long benches, narrow windows, silence broken only by the scratching of quills. Each scribe had his place, his parchment, his task. Hours passed without conversation. The only speech might be a request for more ink or a brief correction from the prior overseeing the work. The rest was endurance. The atmosphere was not romantic, but functional. The desks were plain, the benches hard. The room was often cold, poorly lit, and uncomfortable. Yet it was in these conditions that Europe's intellectual survival was quietly secured. The monotony was the preservation. Without it, centuries of thought might have vanished. Each book represented labor, resources, and time. Parchment required animal skins, ink required preparation, and scribes required food and shelter. A single manuscript could be worth more than a farm. Thus, books were not casually handled. They were chained, guarded, and accounted for. Reading them was a privilege, not a pastime. For the monks, this cost gave weight to their labor. To copy a book was not only to preserve knowledge, but to invest the community's resources into memory. The words became not just ink on parchment, but a symbol of sacrifice, of the animals whose skins provided the vellum, of the men whose hours bent their backs over desks, of the silence endured for the sake of continuity. In hindsight, it is easy to praise the monks for preserving civilization, but in their own time, they did not see themselves as guardians of culture. They saw themselves as servants, obedient to rule, engaged in tedious but necessary tasks. Their silence was not a strategy but a discipline, and yet the result was profound. Because of their copying, texts that might otherwise have vanished survived. The continuity of ideas, fragile as it was, held. It was not intentional greatness, but cumulative endurance. The library, silent and monotonous, became the thread that tied the ancient world to the modern. And so, as you imagine the rows of silent scribes, the slow formation of letters, the steady toll of the bell marking the hours, you might wonder, did they know? Did the monks realize that their monotony was shaping the course of history? Or did they believe they were only scratching letters on the skin, blind to the enormity of what they carried? The monastery's rhythm did not end with work or meals. It ended with Compline, the final office of the day. When the bell tolled, the monks gathered one last time in the chapel, their voices joining in chants that were older than memory. The words floated upward into the rafters, then faded into the night air. Afterward, the great silence began. No words were spoken unless absolutely necessary. The community retreated to its narrow cells, the corridors filled only with the soft shuffle of sandals and the whisper of robes against stone. It is difficult to describe the weight of that silence. Outside the walls, the world was full of noise, markets, blacksmiths, animals, the arguments of townsfolk. Inside, after Compline, there was nothing. Darkness pressed close. The only sounds of the wind, the occasional cry of an owl, or the creak of wood as the building shifted in the night. For the monks, this silence was not emptiness but discipline. It trained the mind to rest, to turn inward, to accept the ordinary without resistance. The silence carried through the hours of sleep. Each monk lay on a simple straw mattress, wrapped in wool, rising again when the bell sounded for nocturnal prayers. Sleep was short, broken, functional. The night was not for indulgence, but for vigilance, as though the community believed that time itself was a gift too fragile to be wasted. Life inside the monastery was steady, but it was not free from the realities of the human body. Illness spread easily in the close quarters, and the diet, though plain and sustaining, did not protect against all deficiencies. Monks aged, weakened, and died. Yet even in death, routine governed. When a monk fell ill, he was moved to the infirmary, where care was provided according to the monastery's resources. Some houses had herbs, poultices, and knowledge preserved in medical manuscripts. Others relied only on prayer. Death was not feared but expected. The rule itself reminded monks to keep their mortality always before their eyes. The funeral was simple. The body was washed, wrapped, and carried to the graveyard. Chants were recited, psalms repeated. The earth opened and closed again. No grand monuments marked the graves, only simple stones, often unmarked, for humility demanded that even in death the monk be equal to his brothers. The graveyard grew quietly over generations, a reminder that life within the cloister was short, but the community endured. The monastery was more than a place of prayer. It was a small world, enclosed yet connected. Its walls separated it from the village, but its influence seeped outward. Fields cultivated by monks fed not only themselves, but sometimes the surrounding poor. Hospitality was a duty. Travelers, pilgrims, and beggars often found food or shelter at monastic gates. The cloister, for all its seclusion, was never entirely cut off. In times of famine or war, monasteries became places of refuge. Their stores of grain, their wells, their orderliness provided stability in chaos. Villagers might resent their wealth or power, but they also relied on their endurance. The monastery was a steady presence. Its bells tolled in the hours regardless of what storms raged outside its walls. Over centuries, monasteries shaped European society in quiet ways. Their fields experimented with crops, their breweries refined ale, their scriptoria preserved texts, their schools taught children to read. The monks themselves may not have thought of these as achievements. They were simply fulfilling their rule. But the result was a network of institutions that anchored Europe through centuries of upheaval. Even kings and lords recognized this influence. They granted land, built churches, and sought prayers from monastic communities. In turn, monasteries grew wealthy, sometimes so wealthy that their humility was compromised. Reform movements arose to restore their simplicity, to return them to the strictness of the rule. History turned and monasteries rose and fell, but their presence remained. By the time Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, monasteries had already imprinted themselves onto the continent's fabric. Roads were marked by abbeys, towns grew around cloisters, and knowledge flowed outward from their scriptoria. What began as communities of men seeking to escape the world had, in the end, shaped the world in ways they themselves could hardly have foreseen. And yet, within their own walls, life remained unchanged for centuries. Bells tolled, psalms were sung, meals were taken in silence, work was done with steady patience. Generations passed, names forgotten, manuscripts copied, graves filled. History outside surged forward with wars, plagues, and discoveries. Inside, the rhythm of the bell endured. If you walk today through the ruins of a medieval cloister, you may hear nothing but wind through stone arches. The silence feels heavy, as though centuries of prayers still hang in the air. But if you listen closely, you might also imagine the small sounds, the scrape of quills, the murmur of psalms, the toll of bells that once ordered every moment of life. It is tempting to view monasteries as relics, as places of quiet irrelevance. Yet without them, much of what we call history might have been lost. Their monotony preserved memory. Their silence carried knowledge. Their endurance bridged centuries. And so the question lingers, in a world that moves faster than ever, what might we lose by forgetting the value of repetition, of patience, of silence? If you want to know how civilization began, you might be tempted to imagine grand temples, kings in golden robes, or armies clashing on the battlefield. But the truth is far less dramatic. Civilization began with clay, not the clay of pottery or art, but the clay pressed with reeds into tablets, drying in the sun. The humblest of materials became the foundation of the first bureaucracy, the quiet machinery that held Sumer together. In the city-states of ancient Sumer, Uruk, Lagash, life was complex. Fields had to be measured, harvests counted, rations distributed. temple supplied. Memory was no longer enough, so the Sumerians pressed marks into clay. At first, they used tokens, small clay shapes representing grain, cattle, or oil, a cone for barley, a sphere for sheep, a disc for oil. These were stored in sealed clay envelopes, known as bulli, to record transactions. Over time, the tokens themselves gave way to impressions made directly in the clay. A reed stylus pressed triangles and lines into wet tablets, capturing the same information without the need for loose objects. Thus began cuneiform, one of humanity's earliest writing systems, not invented to tell stories, but to track accounts. The scribes were the bureaucrats of their age. Seated in workshops or temple courtyards, they learned to form the wedge-shaped signs with precision. Their training began in childhood, memorizing hundreds of symbols. They copied exercises onto tablets, repeating the same list of words and numbers again and again until signs flowed easily. It was slow, dull work, but necessary. Only a fraction of the population was literate. Most relied on scribes to record debts, contracts, and inventories. Imagine the monotony of their labor. A merchant delivers grain to the temple, 20 measures of barley. The scribe records it. A worker is assigned his daily ration of beer, 1 jar. The scribe notes it. A farmer leases a field for a season. The boundaries are described, the rent agreed upon. The scribe presses each sign carefully, dries the tablet, and stores in the archive. Row after row of clay slabs piled up, heavy and unglamorous, yet indispensable. These archives were not libraries of stories, but warehouses of administration. They contained contracts, lists, receipts, inventories. To modern eyes, the contents might appear dull. 5 sheep delivered, 2 measures of oil allocated, 10 bricks owed. Yet it was this dullness that made cities possible. The temple could not feed its workers without knowing how much grain was in storage. The palace could not maintain its projects without calculating how many bricks had been baked. The archives were the nervous system of the city, invisible but essential. Some tablets were sealed with cylinder seals. Small carved stones rolled across wet clay to leave intricate impressions. These served as signatures, proof of identity, authority made visible in spirals of images. A contract without a seal was incomplete, unenforceable. Thus, bureaucracy acquired its symbols of legitimacy, even in its earliest days. The bureaucracy touched every corner of life. Workers received wages in the form of rations, measured grain, oil, or beer. Soldiers were allotted equipment recorded on tablets. Farmers leased fields and paid rent in produce. Priests recorded temple offerings, not for spiritual reasons alone, but to ensure proper distribution. Consider the tedium of a day in Uruk. Scribes seated on reed mats, tablets spread before them, merchants waiting to confirm their deliveries, officials checking seals. The city hummed not with conquest, but with counting. Civilization did not grow from excitement, but from record-keeping. It is easy to overlook this bureaucracy, to focus instead on kings or myths. But without these clay records, the myths might not have survived at all. The same scribes who recorded grain deliveries also copied hymns, proverbs, and epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest stories, exists because a scribe trained in numbers also trained in words. Boredom became the soil in which memory flourished. Yet, one cannot help but wonder about the human side of this labor. Did the scribes, pressing wedge after wedge into wet clay, ever resent the monotony? Did they feel the weight of their task? Or did they think only of the small wages it earned them? We do not know their names, only their marks. But their marks outlasted their lives, carrying forward the hum of their daily work across millennia. And so the question lingers, was civilization born from inspiration, or from the endless patience of those who counted sheep and pressed numbers into clay? If the first clay tablets recorded grain and sheep, it was not long before they recorded something larger. The machinery of government. Ancient Sumer was not ruled only by kings or priests. It was ruled by systems of counting. Bureaucracy was its quiet power, shaping who ate, who worked, who prayed, and who prospered. At the heart of each Sumerian city was not a palace, but a temple. The ziggurat, with its stacked terraces rising above the plains, was more than a place of worship. It was a center of administration. Priests and officials sat within its walls, counting offerings, distributing rations, and recording transactions. The gods may have been the focus of devotion, but it was the priests' clay tablets that organized daily life. Each harvest, farmers delivered a portion of their crops to the temple. Scribes measured the grain, noted the quantity, and assigned it to storage rooms. From these stores, rations were distributed to laborers, workers building canals, servants maintaining temple lands, soldiers guarding city gates. The temple was a bank, a warehouse, and a ledger all in one. As cities grew, so did their demands. Canals required constant maintenance. Walls needed repair. Armies had to be provisioned. To fund these, rulers imposed levies. Taxes were often paid not in coins. There was no coinage yet, but in produced livestock or labor. A man might owe a portion of barley or a number of days digging canals, recorded carefully on clay. Taxes could be complex. Some were seasonal, others annual. Some were tied to land ownership, others to temple service. Scribes tracked it all. Each man's obligation was written, sealed, and stored in archives. Compliance was not optional. To refuse was to invite punishment, often in the form of confiscation or forced labor. This growing complexity gave rise to something new. The official. Sumerian society developed layers of administrators, overseers of fields, inspectors of canals, managers of storehouses. Each had authority over a small domain, and each was accountable through clay. The overseer of fields submitted reports on crop yields. The inspector canals recorded which sections were cleared. These reports passed upward, forming a chain of accountability that tied peasants in the fields to rulers in the palace. Bureaucracy created hierarchy. A farmer no longer answered only to his family or his local temple, but to a system. The system spoke through tablets. It measured his harvest, defined his obligations, and judged his performance. Power no longer resided solely in the visible figure of a king. It resided in the silent authority of records. These records accumulated. Rooms filled with tablets, contracts, receipts, tax records. The archives became the collective memory of the city, extending far beyond what any one person could recall. Decisions were no longer based solely on trust or reputation, but on written evidence. Did a man deliver his share of grain last season? The tablet would show. Did a worker complete his labor duty? The record confirmed it. Bureaucracy replaced memory with clay. Cylinder seals became indispensable, carved from stone with intricate patterns. They were rolled across wet clay to leave impressions that acted as signatures. A seal might depict a god, a king, or a family emblem. Each was unique, tying a transaction to an individual. In an age without paper, ink, or handwriting analysis, seals were identity. Without one, a contract lacked legitimacy. With one, it carried the weight of law. The bureaucracy also shaped justice. Disputes over land, debts, or contract were settled by reference to tablets. A claim without a record was weak. A sealed tablet was decisive. This reliance on records formalized law, paving the way for later codes, such as Hammurabi's. Before laws were inscribed in stone, justice was already etched in clay. For the officials themselves, daily life was not grand. It was paperwork in clay form. Counting sheep, measuring grain, checking canals. Each task mundane, repetitive, unglamorous. But through their patience, cities functioned. Canals delivered water, granaries distributed food, armies stood ready. Civilization advanced not through the brilliance of rulers, but through the monotony of clerks. It is tempting to imagine the great ziggurats as monuments of worship, the kings as figures of might. Yet behind their splendor lay a quiet bureaucracy of scribes, priests, and officials pressing wedges into clay. The temple was not only a house of gods, but a house of numbers. And so the question arises, when we think of the first cities, should we remember the kings who ruled them or the scribes who counted their grain? The further the cities of Sumer grew, the more clay they required. Bureaucracy multiplied with population, trade, and ambition. What began as a system for tracking grain and sheep became the skeleton of civilization itself. Without the tablets, without the scribes who pressed them, the cities might have collapsed under their own weight. Sumer was not rich in every resource. Timber, metals, and precious stones were scarce on the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates. To obtain them, the Sumerians traded, sending boats downriver, caravans across deserts, goods loaded with care. Barley, wool, and textiles flowed outward. Copper, tin, and lapis lazuli flowed in. Every transaction required record. A shipment of grain to a distant city was not entrusted to memory alone. The tablets listed amounts, destinations, recipients. Cylinder seals confirmed authenticity. Trade was not casual barter, but contractual obligation, written and sealed. These records reveal something remarkable. The reach of bureaucracy extended far beyond the city walls. The authority of clay traveled with merchants, binding them to their obligations even in distant lands. In this way, Sumerian bureaucracy stretched across Mesopotamia, tying together a network of exchange through nothing more than marks in wet clay. The tablets also captured the lives of individuals. Contracts survived detailing marriages, adoptions, sales of land, even loans with interest. Each was sealed, each preserved. For the first time in history, ordinary lives left written traces not as heroes or kings, but as signatories to agreements. A farmer leasing a field, a merchant securing a loan, a family adopting a child. All became part of the bureaucratic record. Their identities, once fleeting, were fixed in clay. We do not know their voices or their faces, but we know their obligations, their promises, their debts. Bureaucracy gave permanence to the most ordinary transactions. This permanence also created power. To control the records was to control society. Officials who managed archives held authority not because of swords, but because of clay. A man without a record could be erased from the system, his claims dismissed, his property reassigned. The bureaucracy did not merely describe reality, it defined it. In this way, Sumerian bureaucracy foreshadowed every government to come. Authority was not only visible in rulers, but hidden in documents. The true machinery of power was silent, patient, monotonous. Kings might boast of conquests and inscriptions, but daily life was shaped by the clerk at his desk. From these administrative needs grew something larger, writing itself. At first, cuneiform was restricted to numbers and goods, but over time it expanded to words, names, even stories. The same system that counted grain eventually carried hymns, prayers, laws, and epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh, copied on clay, was a descendant of sheep tallies. It is striking to realize that literature was born not from a desire to entertain, but from the need to account. Civilization's most enduring stories began as paperwork. Without bureaucracy, there might have been no writing at all. Still, the scribes who made this possible lived lives of monotony. Their days passed in repetition, pressing wedges into clay, drying tablets in the sun, stacking them in archives. Most never knew that their labor carried the seeds of culture. They were clerks, not poets. Yet without them, history would be silence. The archives they filled now speak louder than kings. The reigns of rulers are blurred, their monuments eroded, but the clay remains. Tablets listing sheep and grain survive when palaces have crumbled. The boredom of bureaucracy outlasted the brilliance of conquest. We often imagine civilization as a matter of greatness. Grand rulers, soaring temples, epic battles. But the truth is quieter. Civilization was born in the tedium of record-keeping, in the patience of clerks, in the weight of clay tablets stacked in dark rooms. When you picture Sumer, do not think only of ziggurats rising above the plain. Picture instead the scribe, seated on a reed mat, pressing a stylus into damp clay, one wedge after another, hour after hour. His work was not dramatic, but it was decisive. And so we end with a question. If civilization itself could be built upon something as dull as sheep tallies and tax lists, what other ordinary, overlooked details of our own age might someday be remembered as the true foundation of history? When people think of Rome, they picture stone, aqueducts arching across valleys, marble forums gleaming in the sun, or cobble roads stretching toward the horizon. But before the stone, there was wood. Timber was the silent material of Rome's expansion, less celebrated than marble but far more common, the backbone of roads, siege engines, scaffolding, and everyday survival. The Roman road is legendary, often praised for its endurance, but not every road was stone. Many, especially in frontier regions, were built of wood. Engineers laid logs across marshes and wetlands. creating paths strong enough to carry soldiers, carts, and supplies. These timber roads were not monuments. They were practical solutions built quickly, often replaced, seldom remembered. Yet without them, Rome could not have advanced. Archaeologists today find traces of these wooden trackways in places like Britain and northern Europe. Preserved in the damp soil, they reveal the labor of soldiers and engineers who cut, hauled, and placed each log. The work was dull, backbreaking, and unglamorous. But every log laid was another step in the empire's march. Beyond roads, timber served almost every Roman need. Houses were framed with it, ships built from it, scaffolds raised with it. Siege engines, catapults, ballistae, battering rams were all timber structures wrapped in iron. Even the great stone aqueducts relied on wooden scaffolding to rise. In cities, what was fuel for ovens, baths, and workshops. It was shaped into wheels, beams, doors, and tools. The empire's appetite for timber was insatiable. Forests across Italy, Gaul, and the Balkans fell to the axe, each tree consumed by the needs of expansion. Cutting was the work of legionaries, slaves, and laborers. Soldiers on campaign often doubled as lumberjacks, felling trees to build bridges, stockades, and marching camps. Their survival depended on it. A legion could not rest without palisades, could not advance without timber bridges, could not besiege without wooden towers. Each campaign was shadowed by the sound of axes. The work was repetitive. Men hauled logs through mud, sharpened stakes for defenses, lashed timbers into rafts. The rhythm of the army was not only the clash of swords, but the steady thud of chopping. The victories celebrated in marble reliefs were made possible by days of dull labor in the forest. The most famous Roman roads, like the Via Appia, were stone layered with gravel, paving, and drainage. But even these relied on timber at times. Wooden piles supported bridges. Temporary trackways carried supplies, scaffolds raised arches. Where stone was scarce, timber stood in. The empire's strength was not in grandeur alone, but in adaptability. For common travelers, many roads were not paved at all. They were dirt tracks reinforced with logs and boggy ground, replaced as needed. To march along them was not glamorous. Mud clung to sandals. Carts jolted over uneven planks. Repairs were constant. Yet they worked. Grain reached the cities. Soldiers reached the frontiers. Messages reached the governors. The empire advanced not in triumphal processions, but in the dull endurance of wooden tracks. With decays. Unlike stone, it rarely survives. That is why timber roads are forgotten. Yet, in their time, they were indispensable. Without them, armies stalled, trade faltered, and communication broke. Rome's glory rested on foundations that were meant to vanish. Picture a soldier standing knee-deep in mud, hauling a log into place. He does not think of empire. He thinks of his aching back, his hunger, his need for sleep. And yet, his labor carries legions forward. His anonymous work lays the path for emperors and generals to claim victory. History remembers the triumph, not the timber. We admire the permanence of Rome, the stones that still stand after 2 millennia. But perhaps its true genius lay in what did not last. The wooden scaffolds, bridges, and roads that made survival possible. They were not built to endure. They were built to function. And in their quiet, temporary way, they carried civilization forward. And so one wonders how much of history depends not on monuments, but on the forgotten, perishable labor that leaves no trace? When you picture the Roman Empire, you might think of gold, silver, or marble as its great resources. But in truth, it was wood. Timber was a hidden currency of survival, consumed in such quantities that entire landscapes were reshaped. The empire did not just march on roads, it marched on forests. Across Italy and beyond, forests were not viewed as wilderness. They were resources, storehouses of fuel and construction material. Every region had its woodlands measured, allocated, and harvested. The state did not always own the forests, but it regulated them. Timber was too essential to be left to chance. In some provinces, forests were reserved for military use, feeding the constant need for bridges, forts, and siege works. In others, timber was sold to supply cities, where demand was endless. The crackle of wooden ovens and bathhouses echoed the steady fall of axes in the countryside. The Roman city was a furnace of consumption. Bakers required steady supplies of wood to keep their ovens hot. Bathhouses, symbols of Roman culture, devoured timber to heat their vast pools. Workshops used it to fire kilns, forge tools, and smelt metals. Even households relied on it for cooking and warmth. A city the size of Rome, with over 1 million inhabitants at its height, consumed staggering amounts of firewood each day. Cartloads entered through its gates, piled high, brought in from surrounding regions. The forest near the city thinned quickly, forcing suppliers to haul timber from farther afield. Roads and rivers became arteries of fuel. The legions were perhaps the greatest consumers. A single campaign required bridges over rivers, palisade around camps, towers and rams for sieges. Every advance meant more trees felled. Soldiers, often thought of as warriors, were also loggers, their axes as vital as their swords. Consider the construction of a marching camp. Each night, the legions built defenses, trenches dug, palisades raised. Thousands of stakes, sharpened and planted, turned a patch of earth into a fortress. The next day, they marched, only to build again by nightfall. Behind every mile of conquest lay countless trees cut and carried. The Roman navy devoured timber on an even greater scale. Warships required hundreds of trees for hulls, masts, and oars. Merchant vessels, slower but sturdier, consumed even more. Shipyards along the Mediterranean coast were always hungry, stripping forests inland to feed their construction. The fleets that patrolled the seas, carried grain, and projected power were floating forests, shaped and bound into service. This appetite created an economy. Loggers cut the trees, laborers dragged them to rivers, rafts floated them downstream, merchants arranged contracts, officials recorded quotas. It was not glorious work. It was repetitive, heavy, and thankless, but it kept the empire supplied. Inscriptions and tablets occasionally mention these transactions. So many beams delivered to the shipyard, so many cartloads supplied to the baths. Most record are lost, but their existence reminds us that behind Rome's splendor was an endless stream of mundane paperwork and dull transactions. Civilization depended on them, but the empire paid a price. Deforestation spread. Hills stripped of trees eroded. Soils washed away. Rivers clogged with silt. Some regions, once fertile, grew barren. The forests that seemed endless proved finite when matched against the appetite of cities and legions. Roman authors occasionally noted this. Pliny the Elder remarked on the scarcity of certain woods, prized for furniture or ships. Others complained of rising costs as supplies dwindled. The empire's expansion consumed not only land but the very landscapes that supported it. Rome is remembered for its permanence, its roads, aqueducts, and monuments. But behind that permanence was constant consumption of the perishable. Timber burned, rotted, and was replaced. Forests fell, regrew, and fell again. The empire's survival depended not on the eternal but on the renewable, managed with varying success. And so one wonders, how much of Rome's greatness rested not on marble, but on the steady fall of axes in forgotten forests? The sound of axes was once constant in the Roman world. Yet forests, unlike stone quarries, could not be mined endlessly. Their disappearance shaped the empire in ways that rarely make it into the triumphal stories of generals or emperors. Timber was Rome's hidden lifeline, and when that lifeline frayed, the empire strained. Early in Rome's rise, Italy was rich with forests. Oak, beech, pine, and cypress covered the hills. But as centuries passed, the nearest woodlands disappeared. The demand of cities' fleets and armies stripped the landscape bare. Hillsides grew barren, erosion carved into valleys, and soils thinned. To compensate, Rome reached farther. Timber was hauled from Gaul, the Balkans, and Asia Minor. Fleets carried planks and beams across the sea. Even North Africa, though not abundant in great forests, contributed what it could. The empire became a network of extraction, each province feeding the center's appetite. On the empire's frontiers, timber had another role: defense. Forts along the Rhine and Danube were built with wooden palisades and towers. Bridges crossed rivers. Stockades guarded camps, and roads of timber carried supplies through bogs. But this constant building required steady resupply. A neglected frontier meant rotting palisades, weakened bridges, vulnerable posts. In some regions, shortages forced garrisons to rely on stone earlier than planned. Timber was easier to build with but harder to maintain, its disappearance accelerating the strain on frontier defenses. Deforestation brought consequences beyond military supply. Without trees to anchor soil, floods became more frequent, rivers silted, irrigation suffered, farmland declined in fertility. Local communities bore the brunt, their fields less productive, their livelihoods harder to maintain. Some historians argue that Rome's relentless consumption of wood was a slow, hidden factor in its decline, not the dramatic invasions or civil wars, but the quiet erosion of resources. A city without fuel, an army without palisades, a shipyard without beams. These lacked the grandeur of battle but mattered just as much. Rome adapted where it could. Stone replaced timber in many permanent structures. Charcoal, though itself made from wood, was used carefully to fuel metalworking. Olive pits, grapevines, and agricultural waste provided supplementary fuel. But none of these matched the versatility of timber. Wood was flexible, renewable, and essential. Its absence was always felt. By late antiquity, some regions were importing wood at great cost. The empire that once drew strength from its abundance now strained to move heavy loads across mountains and seas. Roads and rivers that once carried soldiers now carried beams and planks. The lifeblood of civilization still depended on trees. When we walk through Roman ruins today, we see only stone. The amphitheaters, aqueducts, and temples stand in their bare frames. But in their own time, these places were full of wood. Scaffolds, beams, seats, doors, roofs, and scaffolding. The grandeur we admire was always propped up by timber that has since vanished. In this way, Rome's true empire was invisible. It stretched not only across provinces but into forests, felling countless trees whose absence can still be traced in the landscape. Every marble arch, every stone road, every tile bathhouse was built upon a scaffolding of wood that no longer exists. Rome's glory endures in stone, but survival depended on wood. The empire was fed by forests, sustained by the steady rhythm of axes, and advanced on timber roads now long rotted away. The collapse of these wooden foundations left no ruins to visit, no monuments to admire. Yet they shaped the limits of empire as surely as any army. And so the thought lingers. If the silence of vanished forests could topple armies and strain empires, what hidden foundations of our own world, ordinary, perishable, unnoticed, sustain us today, waiting quietly to vanish? If Rome was the heart of an empire, Alexandria was its stomach. The city, glittering at the mouth of the Nile, was more than a center of culture or scholarship. It was a granary. Each year, hundreds of thousands of tons of Egyptian grain left its harbors, bound for Italy. Without this steady flow, the city of Rome would have starved. By the 1st century CE, Rome's population had swelled to over 1 million. No city of such size could feed itself from local fields. The Italian countryside simply could not produce enough. The empire turned instead to the Nile, whose predictable floods produced grain in abundance. Egypt became Rome's breadbasket, its fertile fields a foundation of urban survival. But abundance in the fields meant little without transport. Grain had to move from farm to river, from river to Alexandria, from Alexandria to the Mediterranean, and across the sea to Rome. It was not an occasional shipment, but a constant stream, carefully measured, meticulously recorded, endlessly repeated. The empire's strength rested on the monotonous grind of supply. The work began in the Nile Valley. Farmers, many bound by obligation, harvested the grain under the hot sun. Sickles cut through stalks. Bundles were threshed, grain sifted. From there, officials collected quotas owed to the state. Each village delivered its share, tallied by scribes who recorded amounts on papyrus scrolls. The grain was carried to storage depots along the Nile. Workers hauled sacks on their backs, poured grain into bins, and sealed them with clay. Each load was checked, counted, and marked. It was not glamorous labor, dusty, repetitive, exhausting, but it was essential. Without it, the city of Rome would go hungry. Once collected, the grain traveled down the Nile. Barges floated with the current, pile high with sacks. Boatmen steered them through canals, narrow channels, and the great river itself. Along the way, more officials waited to check cargo, note deliveries, and ensure that no grain disappeared into private hands. Arriving at Alexandria, the barges unloaded at sprawling granaries. These were not small storehouses, but massive complexes designed to hold thousands of tons. Workers climbed ladders, poured grain into silos, and swept the floors clean. Dust filled the air. Rats were a constant enemy, and so were thieves. Guards patrolled, scribes listed amounts, and overseers measured rations for the next step of the journey. From Alexandria's harbors, ships departed for Rome. These were not small vessels, but giant merchant ships, some among the largest of the ancient world. Their hulls carried thousands of sacks, stacked carefully to balance weight. Crews labored for days to load them, hauling sack after sack up narrow gangplanks. The work was endless, each load heavy, each step repeated until a hull was full. The fleet itself was organized like a modern shipping line. Departures were timed with the sailing season, avoiding the dangerous winter months when storms swept the Mediterranean. Convoys often sailed together, escorted at times by naval vessels, for the grain was too valuable to risk. Rome's very survival depended on their safe arrival. At Ostia, the port of Rome, the process reversed. Ships unloaded their sacks onto docks. Carts carried them inland, and warehouses stored them before final distribution. The grain was issued as part of the annona, the state grain dole, providing free or subsidized bread to Roman citizens. Without this system, the urban poor might riot. Bread was not merely food. It was stability. To think of empire is to think of conquest. But in truth, Rome's greatest achievement may have been its logistics. The grain supply was not glorious. It was dusty fields, heavy sacks, long barges, crowded ships. It was scribes hunched over lists, dock workers straining under weight, sailors bailing water. It was boredom, repeated endlessly, yet it kept the empire alive. We admire Rome's monuments, its aqueducts and arches, but those stones were meaningless without bread, and the bread came from Alexandria, through a chain of labor so ordinary that history often overlooks it. So the question lingers, was Rome truly built by generals and emperors, or by the farmers, boatmen, scribes, and dock workers who carried sack after sack of grain, year after year, until the empire's hunger was fed? The fleet gathers at Alexandria's great harbor, a forest of masts rising against the horizon. To the casual eye it looks chaotic. Sailors shouting, carts creaking under heavy sacks, overseers scolding laborers. But it is all part of a system honed by repetition. Each year, the same work is done, the same voices call out, the same ropes strain on the same loads of grain. Rome's lifeline is not drama, but routine. Some of these ships are enormous by ancient standards. Roman writers marveled at vessels over 100 feet long, broad enough to carry thousands of sacks. Their hulls, thick with pitch, groan as each load is lowered into place. Sailors move like ants, balancing the weight carefully so that the ship will not list in open waters. The grain fleet is distinct from ordinary merchant ships. It operates under the authority of the state, its mission too important to leave to chance. Captains are chosen for reliability, crews for discipline, though storms may scatter them. The fleet sails in large groups, sometimes under the watch of naval escorts. The grain must arrive. Timing is everything. Ships do not sail year-round. The Mediterranean is dangerous in winter, its storms unpredictable, its winds too strong. The fleet departs in the calmer months, usually spring and summer, when the risk is lower. Schedules are strict. A missed departure can mean shortages in Rome, unrest among the poor, and panic in Senate. Sailors know the rhythm well. Each year they repeat the same tasks, rigging sails, patching hulls, loading cargo, navigating the same routes. The voyage is not an adventure. It is a job, done again and again until it becomes second nature. For the crew, life aboard the grain ships is tedious. Days pass with little to do but adjust sails, bail water, and watch the horizon. Meals are simple, bread, dried fish, water, or thin wine. Hammocks or rough mats serve as beds. The hold is filled not with comforts but with grain, and the smell of it fills the air. Storms bring fear, but calm seas bring boredom. Sailors pass the time with songs, dice games, or stories. Some carve their names into beams or scratch prayers onto wax tablets. Their world is narrow, The deck, the horizon, the endless repetition of waves. Yet monotony is broken by danger. Storms can rise quickly, turning calm seas into chaos. A single gust can tear sails, a wave can flood the hold. Grain, if soaked, swells and shifts, threatening to capsize a ship. Crews scramble to save both vessel and cargo, knowing that to lose the grain is to risk not only their lives but the survival of 1 million people in Rome. Pirates are another threat, though less common for the grain fleet, often protected by escorts. Still, a slow ship heavy with cargo is an inviting target. Sailors keep watch, and captains steer cautiously near coasts where raiders are known to lurk. Even without storms or pirates, accidents occur. Ropes snap, men fall overboard, ships run aground. Each voyage carries risk, and each successful arrival is a quiet triumph that history seldom records. Weeks later, the coast of Italy appears. The fleet gathers at Ostia, Rome's great port, where lighthouses guide them into safety. Here, the monotony begins again in reverse. Grain is unloaded, sack by sack, cart by cart. Dock workers sweat under the same burdens carried in Alexandria, overseen by the same scribes tallying each load. Nothing is left to chance. From Ostia, the grain is moved up the Tiber by barge, reaching Rome's warehouses. The process is steady, slow, and unchanging. Each year it repeats, like the seasons themselves. It is tempting to see the Roman legions as the empire's great army. But perhaps the grain fleet was another army, one of sailors, laborers, and dock workers. Their battles were not fought with swords, but with sacks and ropes, storms and tides. Their victories were measured not in conquered lands, but in bread baked for the masses. Without them, the city would riot. Bread shortages were dangerous. Angry crowds in Rome could topple officials, pressure emperors, destabilize politics. The grain fleet was not only a supply chain, it was a safety valve, holding the city's temper in check. The voyage of the grain ships is not heroic. It is dusty sacks, sore backs, empty horizons, and the creak of wood in salt air. Yet it is in this monotony that empire survived. So one wonders, were Rome's greatest battles really fought on fields with swords, or on the decks of grain ships, where ordinary sailors endured the sea so that bread might reach the city? The sacks of grain unloaded at Ostia did not simply vanish into warehouses. They moved through a carefully organized system, one that fed not just the stomachs of Rome's people, but the politics of the empire itself. Grain was more than food, it was power. By the late Republic and into the empire, Rome had formalized its grain distribution into the Annona. Citizens, at first the poor, later a broader swath of the population, received free or subsidized grain, enough to keep their households fed. It was measured in monthly allotments, handed out under the eye of officials, recorded in registers, and distributed with a bureaucracy that rivaled any army. The system was not generous by accident. Politicians knew that bread secured loyalty. A hungry crowd in Rome could riot, topple magistrates, and destabilize government. To keep the capital quiet, the Annona became as essential as legions on the frontier. From Ostia, barges carried the grain up the Tiber to Rome itself, where it was stored in massive area, granaries with thick walls and raised floors to protect against damp and pests. Workers climbed ladders, hauled sacks, swept floors, and checked stock. Each load was measured carefully, and each movement recorded by scribes. From the granaries, the grain traveled to mills, many powered by water. Stones ground the kernels into flour, and endless, dusty labor repeated day after day. The flour was then baked into bread, distributed to citizens through bakeries or directly through allotments. The process was so routine, so constant, that it became invisible to those who benefited from it. Yet it consumed thousands of lives in steady, monotonous work. Bread and circuses, the phrase often used to dismiss Roman decadence, captures the truth in part. Bread was not just food, but a tool of control. Emperors who secured the grain supply won stability. Those who failed invited unrest. Riot erupted when shipments were delayed, when stores ran low, when bread prices rose. A careless governor in Egypt or a storm that sank the fleet could send tremors through the capital. Officials monitored the grain supply with vigilance. Announcements reassured the public that ships had arrived, stores were secure, and bread would not run short. The health of the empire was measured in loaves as much as in legions. For ordinary Romans, the system meant standing in line. Citizens presented tokens or certificates, proving their right to a share. Clerks checked their names against lists. Sacks of grain or measures of flour were handed out, one after another, until the quota was filled. The process was slow, repetitive, and impersonal, but it kept families alive. The distribution was not always fair. Corruption existed. Officials skimmed supplies, merchants manipulated prices, and some citizens received more than others. But the system endured, adjusted, and repeated year after year, generation after generation. Rome's dependence on Egyptian grain was both strength and weakness. As long as the Nile flooded predictably, as long as ships sailed safely, the city was fed. But any disruption, drought, rebellion, piracy, or storm, threatened disaster. Emperors guarded Egypt closely, knowing that control of its fields meant control of Rome's peace. Augustus placed Egypt under direct imperial administration, forbidding senators from entering the province without permission. It was too important to risk. Whoever held Egypt held Rome's stomach, and through it, Rome's loyalty. Behind the system were countless invisible workers. Farmers in the Nile Valley, boatmen on the river, scribes tallying loads, dock workers hauling sacks, sailors steering grain ships, millers grinding flour, bakers shaping loaves. None of their names are preserved, yet their labor sustained the empire. The emperors may have claimed the glory, but the bread was baked by ordinary hands. Rome is remembered for its arches and forums, its emperors and armies, yet all of it rested on bread. The Colosseum's games meant nothing if the people were hungry. The Senate's debates were drowned by riots when grain ran short. The empire's survival was secured not only by conquest, but by the monotonous, repetitive grind of supply chains stretching from Nile fields to Roman ovens. So perhaps the question lingers. If the fate of the world's greatest city depended on sacks of grain carried by ordinary men, what foundations of our own world are we overlooking today? Quiet, repetitive labors without which everything might collapse? At the heart of Tenochtitlan, among temples and canals, there was a place more important to daily survival than pyramids or palaces. It was a market. Here, in the great square of Tlatelolco, thousands gathered each day to buy, sell, barter, and measure. To the outside observer, it might have seemed chaotic. To the Aztecs, it was order. Spanish chroniclers who first saw the market marveled at its size. They claimed that as many as 60,000 people might gather on busy days. The square was filled with stalls, each carefully arranged. Sellers of food in one section, sellers of cloth in another, tools and weapons in yet another. The organization was deliberate, a system refined through repetition. But scale alone did not make the market impressive. It was its ordinariness, the daily grind of exchange, that sustained an empire. Maize, beans, chilies, and squash changed hands constantly. Cloth, sandals, pottery, and salt filled the square. Fish from the lakes, fruits from the valleys, feathers from distant lands, all passed to the hands of merchants and commoners alike. The market was alive with sound, but not with shouting. Sellers did not hawk their wares. Rules forbade loud cries, and inspectors patrolled to ensure order. Instead, buyers and sellers spoke quietly, negotiating prices, weighing goods, exchanging tokens of cacao beans or quatchly cotton cloth as currency. The square hummed, not with chaos, but with a low murmur of countless small transactions. Inspectors enforced fairness. False weights, dishonest measures, or poor quality goods could be punished. Justice was swift, for the market was too important to allow corruption. The very survival of the city depended on its reliability. Most trade was not exotic. It was ordinary. Maize for tamales, beans for stews, salt for preservation, pots for cooking, sandals for walking. Families came to the market with what little they had to barter, hoping to return with enough food for the next few days. The market also reflected the city's diversity. Traders from distant provinces arrived with rare goods, jade, obsidian, tropical bird feathers. But these were luxuries for the elite. For the majority, the square was about survival, about obtaining the plain but necessary items of daily life. At the center of this system were the paktika, professional merchants who traveled long distances to bring goods into the city. Their journeys were dangerous, often requiring them to act as spies or diplomats for the empire. Yet in the market, their role was subdued. They set out their goods in neat rows, haggled quietly, and obeyed the same rules as everyone else. Prestige existed, but order reigned. The market was essential because Tenochtitlan itself was enormous, perhaps 200,000 people at its peak. Feeding such a population required constant flow. The Chinampas, floating gardens and surrounding lakes, produced maize, beans, and vegetables. But production alone was not enough. Distribution was everything. The market ensured that what was grown, caught, or made reached those who needed it. To walk through the square was not to witness spectacle, but repetition. Women sat with baskets of tortillas, selling one after another. Potters arranged rows of identical vessels. Fishmongers displayed their catch, negotiating over prices that varied little from day to day. The same exchanges happened again and again, hour after hour, year after year. Yet this monotony was the heartbeat of the city. Without it, the temples would have been empty, the palaces silent, the armies unfed. The market was not celebrated in stone, but it was a foundation of everything. The Spanish chroniclers wrote with all about the grandeur of the Tlatelolco market, but its true significance lay not in spectacle, but in the boring rhythm of exchange. It was thousands of hands passing goods, thousands of mouths chewing maize, thousands of ordinary lives bound together by trade. So perhaps the question lingers. When we tell the story of empires, do we remember the kings and warriors, or the vendors who sold beans, one sack at a time until the city was fed? The greatness of the Tlatelolco market did not come from noise or spectacle. It came from its order. Thousands had gathered there without chaos, and that order was not natural. It was enforced. Inspectors, judges, and officials ensured that every trade, every weight, every measure followed rules repeated daily, year after year. At the edges of the market, officials known as Tynquisp Tlayakank watched the stalls. Their duty was simple but vital: maintain fairness. They checked the balance of scales, tested measures, and examined the quality of goods. A sack of beans too light, a basket of tortillas underfilled, a cloak falsely woven. Any of these could bring punishment. Inspectors were not hidden figures. They moved openly among the stalls, their presence a reminder that the empire's authority extended even to beans and maize. The sellers knew them, and though they may have resented their scrutiny, they accepted it. The market's stability depended on it. Punishment for dishonesty was swift. In some cases, fines were imposed. In others, goods were confiscated. Repeated offenses could bring harsher measures, even physical punishment. The logic was clear. The market was too important to allow corruption. A single dishonest vendor could not be permitted to disrupt trust in the entire system. There were also judges stationed nearby, ready to hear disputes. If two merchants argued over price, or if a buyer claimed to have been cheated, the case could be brought before them on the same day. Justice was immediate, ensuring that grievances did not fester and order was not lost. Unlike European markets, where sellers shouted to attract customers, Tenochtitlan's market was quiet. Rules forbade loud calls. Transactions were conducted calmly, with hand gestures, murmured negotiations, or simple exchanges of goods. The absence of noise was not natural. It was discipline. The Aztecs valued order above advertisement. This silence gave the market a different atmosphere. Thousands of people moved, bartered, and exchanged, yet the sound was a low hum rather than a roar. The Spaniards who visited remarked on this difference, noting with surprise how so many could trade with so little disorder. The market was also organized spatially. Sections were dedicated to different goods. Food in one area, textiles in another, tools in another. Even luxuries, gold, jade, feathers, had their place, often grouped together and watched closely. This organization reduced confusion and ensured that buyers knew where to go. To walk through the square was to pass through ordered rows, baskets of chilies, stacks of tortillas, piles of salt, racks of woven cloaks. Each vendor had a space, and though their goods might differ, their behavior did not. Sit, display, negotiate, sell, repeat. The monotony was the point. It made trade predictable. Though barter was common, standardized currency smoothed transactions. Cacao beans served as small units of value. cotton cloth, known as quachli, functioned as a larger measure. Inspectors monitored these as well. A bag of cacao beans that contained stones or shells mixing was fraud. A piece of cloth cut too short was deceit. The rules reached down to the smallest details. This vigilance turned trade into something more than personal exchange. It became civic order. Each transaction reinforced trust in the market, and trust in the market reinforced trust in the empire. And yet, beneath this order, the human side remained. A woman selling tortillas adjusted her basket, offering the same goods to a steady stream of buyers. A fisherman laid out his catch, repeating the same quiet negotiations. A merchant from afar displayed feathers or obsidian, hoping for buyers among the nobles. Each life played out in repetition, framed by the rules that held the market together. It was not freedom in the modern sense, but it was stability. Buyers knew they would not be cheated. Sellers knew that disputes could be resolved. The market was not a place of spectacle, but of trust. The Spaniard described the market of Tlatelolco with awe, but they may have misunderstood its heart. It was not size alone that mattered, nor the variety of goods, but the discipline that turned thousands of transactions into a quiet, steady rhythm. And so a question lingers. Was the true strength of Tenochtitlan in its armies and temples, or in the silent inspectors who weighed beans and measured cloth, making sure that trust, not chaos, ruled the square? The market was more than a square. It was a mirror of the empire itself. Every sack of beans, every woven cloak, every measure of salt reflected the threads that tied together provinces, towns, and people across central Mexico. In its monotony, the market revealed the true foundations of power, not conquest, not spectacle, but supply. Each good on display told a story of distance. Maize from Chinampas, close to the city, salt from the lakes, fish from coastal waters, cacao from the warm lowlands, obsidian from the volcanic highlands, feathers from tropical jungles, gold and silver from conquered provinces. Merchants and traders, many of them Paktika, carried these goods across roads and rivers, often at great risk. They moved quietly, their journeys long, their reward steady rather than spectacular. The market was a final stage of these journeys, where goods lost their exotic distance and became ordinary objects of trade. Tenochtitlan was vast, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants. No city of such size could feed itself from its immediate surroundings. The market solved this problem. It absorbed goods from across the empire and redistributed them in steady rhythms of exchange. Without the market, the temples would have stood empty, the palaces hollow, the armies unfed. The empire's grandeur rested on beans sold by the handful, tortillas sold by the stack, sandals sold by the pair. Ordinary lives sustained extraordinary structures. Though the market was practical, it also had a ritual quality. Rules were enforced with near-sacred seriousness. Inspectors acted almost like priests of order, ensuring that weights were true and exchanges honest. Justice delivered in the market square carried the weight of the empire's authority. In this way, trade was more than economics. It was an extension of Aztec worldview, where balance and order were prized. Just as the gods required offerings to maintain the cosmos, so too the market required discipline to maintain society. When the Spaniards arrived, they were struck not only by temples and pyramids, but by the market. Chroniclers compared it to the greatest plazas of Europe, remarking on its size, its order, and its abundance. Yet after conquest, much of it unraveled. Disease, war, and colonial restructuring disrupted the systems of trade. The great market of Tlatelolco shrank, transformed into a smaller colonial square. But memory of it endured. Even in decline, the idea of the market as a place of order and daily survival survived in local traditions. The Spanish may have toppled temples, but they did not erase the memory of beans exchanged for salt, cloth for cacao. The monotony of trade outlasted conquest. Modern Mexico still carries echoes of this system. Markets remain central, their stalls arranged in sections, their rhythms daily, their voices low. Buyers and sellers repeat transactions in ways that would have been familiar centuries ago. The legacy of Tlatelolco is not stone or monument, but routine, trade repeated until it feels eternal. We often tell the story of the Aztecs through war and ritual sacrifice. But perhaps their true achievement lay in something quieter, the ability to sustain a city of such size through disciplined order trade. The market was not dramatic, but it was decisive. And so the thought lingers. When we measure the greatness of civilizations, should we look first to pyramids and kings, or to the quiet squares where people weighed beans, traded cloth, and repeated the same exchanges until an empire was fed? In the heart of the Sahara, where the horizon stretches unbroken and the wind whispers across dunes, there was a trade that shaped kingdoms. It was not gold, though gold would follow it. It was salt, white, heavy, ordinary salt. To modern eyes, salt seems too common to be precious. But in the medieval world, it was survival. Salt preserved meat, seasoned food, and sustained life in hot climates where bodies lost it quickly. In West Africa, it was sometimes worth its weight in gold. Kings taxed it, merchants hauled it, and caravans carried it across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. The Sahara salt mines, particularly at Tagaza and Tadeni, produced great slabs of crystalline salt. Workers cut them into rectangular blocks, each weighing as much as a man could lift. These slabs became currency, stacked on camelbacks, counted like coins. To own salt was to own life itself. But salt alone meant little without transport. The mines lay deep in the desert, far from the markets of the Sahel. To move it, caravans were formed, long trains of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Each camel carried 2 slabs, balanced carefully, secure with rope. The caravan was a sight of monotony. Day after day, camels plodded forward, their padded feet sinking into sand. Drivers walked beside them, guiding with quiet commands, their faces veiled against wind and dust. The pace was slow, the rhythm steady, the progress unchanging. To travel the Sahara was to endure silence and repetition. The landscape offered little variety, sand, rock, and sky. The sun burned by day, the cold bit by night. Meals were simple, often little more than dates, dried meat, and water measured carefully from skins. Each step was survival. At rest stops, merchants counted the slabs. Each camel was checked, each rope tightened, each load recorded. The blocks of salt were more than trade goods. They were units of value. To lose one to theft, breakage, or miscount was to lose money, food, or standing. Scribes, where present, noted tallies. In smaller caravans, the merchants themselves remembered, repeating the numbers like chants. The counting was tedious, but it gave structure to the journey. Numbers marched with the camels, echoing the monotony of their steps. Salt was not only carried, it was accounted for. Though monotony ruled, danger always lingered. Sandstorms could erase tracks, disorienting both men and beasts. Thirst could strike if wells ran dry or water skins leaked. Raiders sometimes attacked, hoping to see salt as easily as gold. But most days brought not drama, but endurance. Survival was in repetition. Step after step, count after count, mile after mile. After weeks of travel, the caravans reached the Sahel, where the desert gave way to grasslands and towns. Here, salt slabs were exchanged for gold, ivory, cola nuts, or grain. Markets filled with the sound of negotiations. Salt stacked in neat piles like bricks, each slab valued, weighed, and traded. For the merchants, this was a reward. But even here, the process was not spectacular. It was methodical. Count the slabs, note the exchange, seal the deal. Profit was made not in flashes of wealth, but in the steady repetition of a system that connected desert to savanna. The salt roads were not glamorous. They were long lines of camels, slow steps through sand, endless counting of heavy blocks. Yet they shaped empires, fed armies, and linked distant lands. Without salt, kingdoms would have withered. Without caravans, salt would have remained locked in the desert. So perhaps the question lingers. Was it kings and warriors who built West Africa's power, or the anonymous camel drivers who trudged across dunes, balancing slabs of white stone against the weight of hunger and thirst? The salt was heavy, the desert unending and the camels steady. To move across the Sahara was not a journey of spectacle, but a repetition. Each day a mirror of the last. The caravan advanced not in sudden leaps, but in measured steps, each one as ordinary as the grains of sand beneath their feet. A caravan day began in silence. Before dawn, drivers stirred, untying ropes, checking loads. Camels grown as slabs of salt were hoisted once more onto their backs, the weight balanced with care. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows that shortened as heat climbed. The pace never quickened. Camels moved with a gait that was steady, deliberate, impossible to rush. Their endurance lay not in speed, but in consistency. Hour after hour, they plodded, the sound of padded feet pressing into sand blending into the silence of the desert. Meals were sparse, eaten while walking. A handful of dates, a swallow of water, a strip of dried meat. Conversation was minimal. The desert allowed little distraction. The horizon never changed. Survival hinged on wells. The routes were planned around them, each stop marked by memory and tradition. A missed well meant disaster. When the caravan reached one, the scene was the same each time. Camels knelt, their load set aside, ropes unwound. Water skins were unstrapped and refilled. Each drop guarded. The wells were not always generous. Some were shallow, others deep, requiring laborious hauling of buckets. Drivers waited in line, patient, for their turn to draw water. The camels drank slowly, their long necks dipping and lifting, while men crouched in shade if any could be found. Once skins were filled and beasts refreshed, the journey resumed. At night, the caravan halted. Camels were unburdened, salt slabs stacked carefully, ropes coiled. Fires were lit if fuel could be found, often little more than scrub or dung. Meals were plain, eaten quickly, and sleep came early. The desert grew cold. Stars stretched endlessly overhead and silence thickened. Morning brought the same tasks again, lifting, loading, tying, walking. The cycle repeated without variation. Weeks of travel blurred into one another, each day indistinguishable from the last. Though monotony ruled, caution never faded. Guards walked the edges of the caravan, eyes scanning for raiders. Most days, there was nothing, but the risk was real enough to demand vigilance. Weapons were carried. Spears, bows, sometimes swords. Even so, defense depended less on combat than on deterrence. A caravan too large, too disciplined, was not easily attacked. Each evening, loads were checked. A camel's burden was examined. 2 slabs, ropes intact, balance secure. Numbers were recited, merchants confirming tallies. It was not unusual for drivers to repeat the counts aloud, the rhythm of numbers anchoring the monotony of the day. Salt slabs were sturdy, but accidents happened. A fall could break one. A slip could scatter sand across its surface. Each loss was noted, each miscount adjusted. The system tolerated no forgetfulness. Salt was too precious to vanish unrecorded. For the drivers, life was harsh. Heat by day, cold by night, thirst always near. Feet blistered, lips cracked, skin darkened under relentless sun. Pay was modest, often given in goods rather than coin. Yet for many, the caravan was livelihood. Without it, villages along the edge of the desert would wither. There was little glory in the work. The drivers were anonymous, their names lost to history, their voices unheard. But without them, the caravans would not move, and without the caravans, kingdoms would starve of salt. The salt roads were not marked by milestones or monuments. They were marked by repetition. Footsteps, hoisted loads, refilled water skins, counted slabs. The desert swallowed grandeur. What endured was monotony, and within monotony, survival. And so one wonders, if empires can be built on something as dull as lifting slabs of salt day after day, what other unseen labors carry the weight of history on their backs? The end of the desert was not sudden. The sands gave way gradually to scrub, then to grasslands. For weeks, the caravan had known only silence and monotony, sand, sky, and the steady plod of camels. Now came the noise of towns, the smell of cooking fires, the press of people. The salt had reached the world that needed it. In towns like Timbuktu, Gao, and Wallata, caravans unloaded their burdens. Slabs of salt, stacked neatly in piles, became the centerpiece of markets. Buyers approached, weighed the blocks, tested their quality, and haggled quietly. Payment came in grain, in cloth, in ivory, and most famously in gold. The exchange was orderly but repetitive. Each slab was counted, each trade recorded. sometimes with marks on wood or clay, sometimes only with memory. Traders who had endured weeks of monotony in the desert now faced the monotony of negotiation. Discussing, weighing, agreeing, repeating the process slab by slab, pile by pile. The connection between salt and gold became legendary. West Africa's gold fields lay south of the Sahel, in forests and rivers far from the desert. Caravans of salt traveled south. Caravans of gold moved north. Kings grew rich, taxing both directions. Their power fed not by conquest, but by exchange. For the people of the Sahel, salt was worth more than gleaming metal. It seasoned food, preserved meat, and sustained life. Gold could adorn, but salt could save. That is why slabs of salt were sometimes treated as currency themselves, stacked in treasuries, counted in tribute, offered as gifts of value equal to wealth. The salt roads did more than move goods. They connected worlds. From the Mediterranean came textiles, books, and manufactured goods. From the Sahel came grain, gold, and slaves. From the desert came salt. Towns along the routes flourished, growing into centers of culture and learning. Timbuktu, later famed for its scholars and libraries, was first a trading post for salt. This web of trade rested on monotony. Caravans moved, markets exchanged, taxes collected year after year. Empires rose and fell around it, but the roads endured, marked not by monuments but by repetition. Even after the height of the medieval empires, the caravans continued. For centuries, men and camels walked the same routes, carrying the same slabs, facing the same monotony of sand and silence. Only in modern times, with railways and trucks, did the salt roads fade. Yet their legacy remained. The towns built on their trade survived, their histories shaped by salt. The memory of the caravans lingers in oral traditions, in ruins of market squares, in the rhythms of desert life that persisted long after empires crumbled. Salt does not glitter like gold, yet it sustained kingdoms. The caravans were not heroic in the usual sense. They were dull, repetitive, grueling. Men lifted, loaded, counted, walked. Camels plodded, step after step, across endless dunes. But from this monotony emerged wealth, power, and connection. So perhaps the question lingers. When history remembers wealth and empire, should it look not to gold but to the quiet slabs of salt that made survival and civilization possible? In the dense forests of Mesoamerica, where temples rose above green canopies and plazas echoed with rituals, the Maya built their world not only with stone, but with time. Time, to them, was not abstract. It was measured, recorded, and carved into calendars that ordered their lives as surely as bells ordered monks or tablets ordered Sumerian scribes. The most visible of these calendars were great carved stones, often circular, their surfaces filled with glyphs and symbols. To the casual observer, they might seem decorative. To the Maya, they were maps of time, charts of days, months, and cycles repeating endlessly. The Maya tracked time with remarkable precision. They used multiple systems at once. The 260-day ritual calendar, Tsokin, the 365-day solar calendar, Hab, and the long count, which stretched across centuries. These interlocking cycles turned time into something tangible, something that could be counted, predicted, and carved. Behind the stones were the Aj Kenab, the daykeepers, priests and scribes who memorized the cycles, tracked the passing of days, and ensured that rituals matched the calendar. Their labor was not dramatic. It was repetitive. Count, record, chant, repeat. Each sunrise demanded attention. Each sunset confirmed a tally. The stones themselves required craftsmanship. Stonemasons chiseled glyphs with patient precision, line by line, curve by curve. It was tedious, heavy work. A single misstroke could ruin a carving meant to endure for centuries. Yet they persisted, repeating the same glyphs, the same cycles, across countless monuments. Unlike stories or myths, calendars had no plot. They recorded no heroes, no battles. They recorded days. To the Maya, this was enough. The cycle of time itself was sacred, and its steady repetition demanded reverence. Imagine standing in a plaza as a priest points to a stone, reciting the day's position within multiple cycles. For Jaguar, in the month of Pop, in the year marked by the long count. To the listeners, it was not exciting. It was confirmation. The world was still in order. The cycles held. The calendar touched every part of Maya life. Farmers planted crops according to its rhythms. Rulers scheduled rituals by its guidance. Marriages, ceremonies, and festivals aligned with auspicious days. Even the most ordinary tasks, sowing maize, harvesting beans, were measured against the silent stones. Time was not left to chance. It was structured, repeated, recorded. Life unfolded in rhythm of the calendar. Each action another step in an endless cycle. We often imagine history as shaped by sudden events. But for the Maya, it was shaped by repetition. The counting of days, the carving of glyphs, the steady measurement of time. Their monuments stand not only as temples or tombs, but as calendars, stone reminders that history itself is built on cycles, not surprises. And so one wonders, is civilization held together by dramatic events or by the quiet patience of those who count the days, one after another, until centuries take shape? The great calendar stones impress the eye, but they were only the surface of the system. Behind each glyph, behind each carved number, there was a human mind repeating cycles with relentless patience. These were the AJ Kinab, daykeepers, the men and sometimes women who held the memory of time itself. Training a daykeeper began in childhood. A boy might be chosen for his sharp memory, his steady patience, or his family's lineage of priestly service. His first lessons were not in temples, but in counting, reciting numbers aloud, memorizing the 260-day cycle of Tzolk'in, then repeating it until it became second nature. The rhythm of learning was monotonous but precise. Each day had a name and a number, combined to form a sequence that would not repeat for 260 days. The apprentice recited them like chants. 1 crocodile, 2 wind, 3 house, and so on, until he could speak them without hesitation. Then the sequence began again. Layered onto this was a hob, the solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short month of 5 nameless days. The challenge was not simply to note each cycle, but to know how they interlocked, the endless wheel of ritual and solar calendars meshing into patterns that repeated only every 52 years. There were no libraries of printed calendars, no mechanical clocks. The memory of the daykeepers was the archive. Their recitations ensured that rituals aligned with sacred days, that kings performed ceremonies at proper times, that farmers sowed and harvested according to cosmic order. Each morning, a daykeeper noted the passage of the day within the cycles, reciting aloud, sometimes recording in codices made of bark paper. The records themselves were simple, columns of glyphs, painted carefully with brush and pigment. But the true work was mental, a constant turning of cycles in the mind, each day another tick in an endless count. When calendars were carved in stone, daykeepers worked alongside stonemasons. The priest confirmed the glyphs, the mason chiseled them. It was not fast work. Stone resisted, tools dulled. Each line, each curve required time. To complete a single calendar stone could take months or years, and yet the glyphs themselves repeated patterns known for centuries. There was no invention here, no sudden creativity. The work was endurance. A cycle recorded once was recorded again and again, each inscription confirming what memory already held. The daykeeper's role was not only intellectual, but spiritual. Each date carried meaning, some auspicious, some dangerous. Rituals were performed accordingly. A marriage might be delayed to avoid an unlucky day. A king might time his accession for a favorable alignment. Even farmers turned to daykeepers for advice, asking which days would bless planting or harvest. To outsiders, it might appear superstition, but to the Maya it was order. The cycles revealed harmony between earth and sky, between human life and cosmic rhythm. The daykeepers' chants and counts were the threads that tied the community to this order. The most striking feature of Maya timekeeping was its patience. The long count stretched across centuries, numbering days from a mythical beginning. Daykeepers recited dates that reached far into the past and projected far into the future. Their work was not bound to a lifetime, but to eternity. This patience required a mindset unfamiliar to modern thought. To spend one's life counting cycles that would not repeat for 52 years was to accept monotony as sacred duty. It was not about novelty, but continuity. Each day was another bead in a necklace that extended beyond memory. We often think of calendars as tools, devices for marking appointments, planning harvests, or remembering anniversaries. For the Maya, calendars were life itself, and the day keepers, through endless repetition, gave structure to that life. So the question lingers, was it the kings who ruled Maya cities or the day keepers who quietly held time in their hands, ensuring that each day unfolded in order without fail? The stones remain, even when the people who carved them are long gone. Their glyphs speak of time not as a line, but as a circle endlessly turning. For the Maya, this was not philosophy but daily reality. The calendar stones were reminders that nothing was new, nothing final. Everything returned. In the Maya vision, time was not progressive. It was cyclical. Days, months, and years moved like interlocking gears. A ceremony performed today echoed one performed decades earlier and anticipated another to come. Life itself was measured not as a straight path, but as a series of returns. This worldview shaped everything. Farmers sowed maize not simply because the season demanded it, but because the cycle demanded it. Kings performed rituals not only for legitimacy, but to align themselves with cosmic rhythms. Even death was seen not as an end, but as a turning, an entry into cycles that would continue. Perhaps the most remarkable expression of this worldview was the long count. Unlike the short cycles of ritual and solar calendars, the long count numbered days from a mythical beginning. August 11th, 3114 BCE. In our reckoning, dates stretched across thousands of years, projecting both backward into myth and forward into futures yet to come. To carve such dates was an act of patience beyond a single lifetime. A stela might record a ruler's reign, not only in human terms, but in cosmic cycles, placing him within spans of time too vast for memory. The effect was humbling. Kings ruled for decades, but time ruled forever. When the Spanish arrived, they brought their own calendars, their own sense of time, linear, tied to Christian history. They burned many Maya codices, erasing centuries of records. Temples crumbled, rituals ended, daykeepers silenced. Yet the cycles endured. Farmers still planted by seasons, rituals persisted in villages, and the memory of sacred days survived in oral traditions. The stones themselves, buried in forests, kept silent witness. Even when misunderstood, they held their message. Time repeats. Centuries later, scholars uncovered the stones again. At first, their glyphs seemed indecipherable, their patterns obscure. Slowly, through patient study, the cycles were revealed. What seemed decorative proved to be calendars of astonishing complexity. Modern fascination with the Maya calendar peaked in 2012, when misinterpretations suggested the long count predicted an apocalypse. But the Maya themselves never saw an end. For them, 2012 was merely the close of a cycle and the beginning of another. The world did not end. The cycle continued, as it always had. The true legacy of the Maya calendar stones is not prophecy, but patience. They remind us that civilizations are not built on sudden events alone, but on the steady measurement of days. Their monotony, counting, carving, repeating, was not wasted effort. It was the structure of life itself. Even today, echoes of their system remain in indigenous communities, where ritual calendars guide planting, festivals, and ceremonies. The Spanish may have imposed their linear history, but the cyclical heartbeat of time never fully vanished. We often remember civilizations by their monuments of power, pyramids, palaces, armies. But perhaps their deepest legacy lies in something quieter, the way they measured time. For the Maya, time was not conquered, but observed, honored, and endured. And so the question lingers. When our own calendars fade, will the measure of our days endure as theirs did? Etched in stone, patient, silent, waiting for someone centuries later to see in them the true rhythm of life? Empires are remembered for armies, palaces, and scholars. But in the Han Dynasty, as in any age, daily life was shaped just as much by humbler tasks. Among them was laundry, washing clothes by hand, by river, with tools so simple they have almost vanished from memory. It was work done mostly by women, repeated endlessly, sustaining households while emperors ruled from distant capitals. Picture the banks of a river in the Han era. The water runs shallow, clear enough to reveal smooth stones. Women gather in groups, baskets on their hips, bundles of clothing slung across their shoulders. They kneel by the water, soaking cloth, scrubbing with hands, striking garments against flat stones or wooden boards. The sound is not dramatic. It is the steady rhythm of fabric hitting rock, the splash of water, the murmur of voices. Children play nearby, their laughter mixing with the quiet labor of their mothers. It is a scene that repeated across villages, towns, and cities, so ordinary that historians often overlooked it. Laundry in the Han Dynasty required few tools. A flat stone served as a washboard. Ashes or natural lye mixed with water acted as soap. Sticks or paddles beat dirt from thicker cloth. Baskets of bamboo carried clothes to and from the river. Clothing itself was mostly hemp or silk, depending on class. Hemp, durable and coarse, required vigorous scrubbing. Silk, delicate and costly, demanded gentler care, often washed by hand in basins rather than struck against stones. Both required patience. Both consumed time. Laundry was not a once-a-week task. In a world without machines or modern storage, washing was frequent. Sweat, dust, and mud clung quickly to garments in an agrarian society. Farmers dirted hemp tunics daily. Children tore and stained their clothes in play. Even officials in their silk robes relied on servants to maintain their appearance through constant washing. Each washing followed the same rhythm. Soak, scrub, beat, rinse, wring, dry. Fabrics were laid over stones or stretched across grass to dry in sun. Wind fluttered garments like banners, signaling another cycle completed. By evening, dry clothes were folded and carried home in baskets, only to return days later for the same process again. Laundry was not only work, but social space. Women gathered together, sharing stories, exchanging news, teaching daughters the techniques of scrubbing and wringing. The riverside became a place of conversation, laughter, sometimes song. In a society where women's voices were less heard in formal spaces, the laundry banks offered their own quiet forum. Servants in wealthier households did the same work, though in courtyards or designated wash areas. Their labor was invisible in records, but vital to maintaining the elegance of officials and nobles. Without them, silks would have dulled, robes stained, appearances tarnished. It is easy to dismiss laundry as trivial, but consider its role. Clean garments marked status. Silk robes presented officials as dignified. Hemp tunics marked farmers as orderly. Rituals often required purity of dress. Without laundry, appearances faltered, respect diminished, and social order frayed. In this way, laundry sustained more than hygiene. It sustained the image of civilization itself. The Han Dynasty is remembered for Confucian scholars, terracotta soldiers, and the Silk Road. It was also shaped by women kneeling at rivers, scrubbing tunics, wringing robes, drying cloth under the sun. Their work was monotonous, repetitive, and uncelebrated. But without it, daily life would have been unlivable. And so the question lingers. When we write history, should we remember only emperors and scholars, or also the women at the riverside, whose steady rhythm of washing gave empire its fabric of respectability? Clothing in the Han Dynasty was more than fabric. It marked class, ritual, and respectability. Yet whether hemp or silk, coarse or fine, every garment required the same constant care, washing. Within households, laundry became an unending cycle, tying servants, wives, and daughters to a rhythm of work as vital as farming or cooking. For farmers and commoners, clothing was simple. Hemp tunics and trousers were durable but quick to soil. Dust from fields, sweat from labor, mud from paths, all clung to fabric. These garments were not many. Most families owned only a few sets. That scarcity made laundry constant. To let clothing rot with sweat or dirt was unthinkable. Washing fell to wives and daughters. At dawn, they carried garments to rivers or wells, scrubbed them with ash water, beat them against stones, and laid them to dry. The process was not special, but necessary. Performed again and again, week after week, season after season. For officials and scholars, clothing was silk. Silk showed refinement, status, and learning. But silk was delicate, demanding careful handling. Servants washed it with gentler methods, soaking in basins, rubbing lightly with hands, drying in shaded courtyards. This work required more than strength. It required skill. To wrinkle silk was careless, to tear it disastrous. Servants trained in patience, learning the correct motions, repeating them until they became habit. The monotony was a form of discipline, sustaining the image of their masters. In wealthier homes, laundry became organized labor. Servants divided duties. One soaking garments, another scrubbing, another wringing, another carrying water. Courtyards filled with lines of drying cloth, fluttering like banners of domestic order. The work was supervised by mistresses of the house, who ensured that garments were not lost, damaged, or neglected. Inventories sometimes recorded garments with meticulous detail. So many robes of silk, so many tunics of hemp, so many sashes of wool. Each required care, and each cycle of washing was noted. In households where dozens of people lived, the amount of laundry could be overwhelming, yet it followed the same repetitive rhythm: wash, dry, fold, store. For servants, laundry was among the least glamorous of duties. Unlike cooking, which produced visible feasts, or weaving, which created new garments, laundry left no lasting trace. A robe scrubbed clean today would be soiled tomorrow. The work erased itself even as it was done, demanding endless repetition. Yet invisibility did not mean insignificance. A noble in stained robes would be shamed in public. A scholar in soiled silk would lose respect. Laundry ensured dignity, and servants bore that responsibility quietly, without recognition. Clothing was not only daily necessity, but ritual requirement. Ceremonies demanded pure garments, often white hemp or carefully tended silk. Before funerals, weddings, or ancestral rites, households washed clothing with extra care, ensuring no blemish offended ancestors or guests.